Thank you so much for making me feel so welcome. It's hard to believe it's been 4 seasons. I am so lucky, so honored. It is just a joy to be here. I realize in this time I have written program essays, blog posts, there's been panels, moderated discussions, but I haven't done sort of a formal talk for you guys before. And it's really a pleasure to do this now. You get to see me, and I'm trying not to have too much of the professor hat. So I want to say that I'm really excited to talk about this opera and Camille Saint-Saëns with you, Samson and Delilah. We know that dramaturg Jonathan Dean has this wonderful podcast that is online. Alex himself will be giving the pre-concert talks. So with those, you will get a lot of this nice information about Saint-Saëns, French opera in the 19th century, and to walk through each of the acts and highlights, which allows me right here to go down a few rabbit holes, so to speak, and go into some depth about some of these big, broad issues and themes that tie Saint-Saëns and his opera, Samson and Delilah, to genre, to French history in the 19th century, and just sort of different things that as I'm revisiting this work, think, what would I want to know? You guys are such an incredibly knowledgeable and loving audience of opera, and so it's a joy to talk to you because I can share some of the things that I'm really interested in. So I'm going to be bringing these themes together, and there'll be time for questions, discussions at the end. And so what I'll do now is I will start with setting the scene with some of these big questions. I'm going to be organizing this talk around 4 main questions. The first, what is French opera in the late 19th century, and what is Saint-Saëns getting into? What's the context? How does Saint-Saëns fit into this picture? And then how does this specific opera fit into the picture of French opera and Saint-Saëns' career? And the fourth question is, what is orientalism and colonialism and imperialism and exoticism and all these sort of words around empire that help provide a background to thinking of these and sort of where I get to go and bring you more deeply into these things. So these are the 4 questions I'm going to be thinking about. Leading into the 19th century, by the time we get to, so this first question, what is French opera in the late 19th century? Let me set that up a bit. There was an incredibly vibrant artistic operatic scene in Paris throughout the 19th century. And Samson and Delilah and Saint-Saëns are working in a really rich tradition. Let me go back even a little further. When we say, we generally say that opera was born, or you could even say invented, in Italy, right around Florence. It's a bunch of intellectuals called the Florentine Camerata, and this is at the end of the 16th century, going into the 17th century. France had a strong tradition of opera leading up into the 19th century, and while Italian opera, or opera as it was born in Italy, that was popular in the German-speaking areas in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, St. Petersburg, with Catherine the Great there in the 18th century. All over the place, Italian opera was really popular. But France had its own tradition of opera, and it's the first non-Italian country to develop its own tradition. It's the first to set its own language, French, to music, which I really think is what is a national opera? What's German opera? What's English opera or American opera? It's when you set what's Czech opera, Russian opera. How does the language get encoded musically to follow and feel at least related to, even if it's not exactly speech stress, but close to it? So the French were there, they were the first non-Italian group to develop a national opera, and there were a few things that made it so sort of French. The language is the first one. Also dance or ballet is an incredibly important part of French opera. Probably because, why did France have this early non-Italian opera tradition? In addition There also was Italian opera in France, and it's probably because they had a strong spoken theater tradition in the 17th century. Think of Molière and Racine. And there was the strong support of their king, Louis XIV, who reigned from sort of the around 1640s through his death in 1715. He was an accomplished dancer, and he loved to perform in these opera ballets. So the sponsorship, the dance, this is all embedded in this French language opera. Another point I want to talk about, sort of leading into what is French opera in the late 19th century, is how we think of music history, and particularly European classical music history. We talk about it through the sort of major artistic centers where innovation is drawn, and that leads the way for foreigners to flock there. The major artistic center in the last third of the 18th century, through the first decades of the 19th century, was Vienna. And if you think of Haydn, who was actually born in Vienna, trained there at the main cathedral. Mozart was from Salzburg. He goes to Vienna around 1783. Beethoven, born in Bonn, he goes to Vienna in 1790, or 1791, right as Mozart is leaving or dying. So we have Vienna is the place that was attracting everyone, and we think of the classical music tradition there. And Vienna is still important musically and remains important musically throughout the 19th and 20th century. However, around the 18 teens into the 20s, Paris emerges as the major artistic center of Europe. And hence, this really lays the groundwork for French opera in the 19th century. So let me set the scene further. Now that you've got the king is sponsoring opera, France has been strong with this operatic tradition. Even Italy, who invented opera, the major early 19th century, primo Ottocento, we love to call them, Italian composers wrote their last operas for Paris. Interestingly, I don't think this was planned, but it happened. We have Rossini's last opera, Guillaume Tell, from 1829, was at the Paris Opera. Now, this is William Tell, and this is Rossini lives to 1868, but he moved to Paris in the 20s. He got a great job and an annual salary from the French government. And he said, hey, opera's changing. I don't have to write anymore. I'm getting paid. So he doesn't write any more operas after 29. He writes some other things, but Bellini, he was born in 1801, so he didn't know that Puritani was his last opera because he was so young. But sadly, he died. He had some terrible intestinal stuff that got infected. So Puritani. Now, I Puritani, the Puritans, was written for the Théâtre Italien, and that 1835 is the year he died. And then we have the Paris Opera again, and Donizetti with Dom Sébastien. Was written in 1843, and he lived until 1848, but sadly he'd contracted syphilis, and he wasn't fully in his good, healthy mental body or mind at that point. So the main sort of trio of the Primo Ottocento, Rossini, Bellini, Donizetti, all knew, yes, we have to write operas for Paris. Paris is where it's moving. We also have Verdi writes many operas for Paris. Les Vespres Siciliens, the Sicilian Vespers in 1855, Don Carlo in 1867, and then he had a bunch of operas that were adapted for Paris. We have even Wagner, whose operatic career, he was in exile for a while, but his opera Tannhäuser from the 1840s, he revised for Paris in 1860. So Paris is definitely the big center for opera. Let's talk a little bit about the theaters. And there are three big opera houses. Now, there are a lot of opera houses in Paris, as well as theater and dance theaters on the boulevard, like so many, but there are three major ones that sort of set the scene for opera in Paris. The first one is the most impressive, the biggest, the one that goes back to Louis XIV, and this is the Paris Opera. It changed locations in various points, the Garnier is the one which is the picture down there. Wasn't built until the 70s, 1870s, but this was around in the 1600s, in the 17th century. I'll say this in a few different ways to try to reinforce it, but the major elements of what makes opera so special in the Paris Opera, and this is the model of which Samson and Delilah comes out of. We have 5 acts. There's a ballet, frequently a couple of dance numbers, but at least one big ballet. And there's these heroic, tragic subjects. So people die at the end of opera frequently in the Grand Opera. We also have the Théâtre Italien, and this should look familiar, or that word, that place, because this is where Bellini's I Puritani was performed. This is opera in Paris this is Italian opera, frequently Italian composers, Italian singers, and this is where in Paris, that has everything, you can hear Italian opera. Later on, you get non-Italians, French folks who are writing Italianate operas, and you even begin to get a school of French singers singing in the Italianate style. But the Théâtre Italien is, Paris has everything, here's Italian opera. And then the third place is the Opéra Comique. And even though it's named, comic opera, yes, it could be funny, but mainly it's the lighter topics. People don't die in the Opéra Comique, or you're not supposed to. And the big thing is, instead of setting the music thoroughly with sort of the recitative that connects the big numbers, spoken dialogue is what you have at the Opéra Comique. And there'd be musical numbers, and this is the family theater. In fact, just a little side note, Bizet's Carmen was first performed, and it was commissioned by Camille Saint-Saëns, who was a new impresario, director of the Opera Comique in the early 70s. And Carmen from 1875, just a few years before Samson and Delilah in 77, Bizet's opera, Carmen, which many of you are probably familiar with, it wasn't popular when it was first performed. And that's because it was performed at the Comique, where you should not have, it's not a light family topic, and you've got a bullfight and this gruesome death at the end. So, but then by the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Opera Comique becomes a really leading progressive theater. And yeah, okay, so those are the 3 opera houses in Paris, just to give you a sense of what was happening there. In order to really get a sense and to set up, and I know we will be getting to Saint-Saëns and Samson and Delilah, but just to give you more of a sense of what was happening with opera in Paris, you've got Giacomo Meyerbeer. Interestingly, his dates are almost exactly contemporaneous with Rossini. Rossini was born a year later in 1792, and Rossini died in 1868. Additionally, they also moved to Paris from, they both moved to Paris around 1824, 1825. But let's jump back a little bit. Meyerbeer was born Jakob Liebermann Beer in Berlin, German composer, and he goes to Italy in 1816. Thinking of him and Rossini, this is the same year of Barber of Seville by Rossini, and he says, I'm in Germany, I want to write opera, I'm going to go to Italy to figure out how to write opera. Handel did this in the 18th century with Agrippina before he then goes to England, London, and writes a lot of operas, Italian operas. But here we've got a German, very musically talented, goes to Italy and writes 6 operas. I actually have an article about these operas if you ever want to learn more about them. The last opera was his sort of biggest opera of those 6, Il Crociato in Egitto, the Egyptian Crusades from 1824, and it became a nice entry for him to move to Paris. He loved being in Italy, and in his letters he talks of, I breathed and lived Italy, I almost became Italian. So he changed his name, and that's why he's called from Jakob Liebermann Beer to Giacomo Meyerbeer. And that's how we know him. He goes to Paris in 24, and he develops this new style of opera. As a German who has this history of German counterpoint and sort of wonderful use of the orchestra, he goes to Italy, learns how to set language, Italian beautifully, and he develops this new type of opera. He's the chief architect of French grand opera, and that is the genre I want to talk about now to give you a sense of sort of what it is and how Saint-Saëns' works fit into it. This is actually a lovely picture of L'Africaine, Meyerbeer's last opera. Okay, here we go. Meyerbeer's French grand operas. He has Robert le Diable from 1831, Les Huguenots from 1836, Le Prophète, 49, and then L'Africaine from 1865. Actually performed posthumously. He died right before that in 64, but he had finished composing it enough. We'll talk about, or he finished composing it, putting on the production, learning about it. I'm not going to go much into these operas. We can certainly talk about them further. They're different aesthetic, and they're very rarely done, unfortunately, I think. Let's talk about some characteristics. And this is a picture from L'Africaine. But if you didn't know that, and if you do know opera, you might even think it's from Aida. And Aida is a Verdi opera written for Cairo in the Cairo Opera House, but it's a very French grand opera in style. So you can think about some of these things related to, if you happen to know the Meyerbeer operas, L'Africaine or Aida. So French grand opera has 5 acts. French grand opera has ballet. French grand opera is about spectacle and pageantry. And the eruption of volcanoes, or the La Juive is a big opera by Alivet, and at the end you have Rachel, who ends up jumping into a vat of burning oil. You know, horrifying things. A fun thing, a fun fact, is for Les Huguenots, roller skates were popular in Paris in the 1830s. So there's a whole scene with people, the poor chorus, there were lots of broken ankles, but they had to learn to use roller skates. So grand spectacle, pageantry, and think of it, because we've got a time where we don't have movies, we don't have, you know, this is where you went to see life bigger than your own life in different places. And then here we've got these operas. So the ballet, 5 acts, the spectacle, I think I'd mentioned that in an earlier slide. But the thing that I want you to think about here is sort of what makes French grand opera. You've got these big, grand sets, and you've got large political situations, wars, religions, different major conflicts on a grand scale, but then it'll be personalized because you have sort of the individual, the family drama, or the love story. So you have the big, but it's not too impersonal because you've got it made personal with the smaller dramatic story. Okay, so that's a bit about sort of what is opera, French opera in the 19th century. Let's move more closely into Saint-Saëns and Samson and Delilah. So let's talk about the compositional team and the history. In the 19th century, and even up through a big part of the first half of the 20th century, when we think about compositional team, we're talking about the composer, and we're talking about the librettist, the poet who writes and versifies the words, what everybody sings. Today, when we have operas, we also include the compositional team frequently to the director, the institution that commissioned the opera, so the compositional team, and we're in such a wonderful moment of opera where, and in fact, Thousand Splendid Suns is coming up here in Seattle. You've got an opera, and these are operas where there's a huge team. But I'm going to focus now, at least as we're looking at things in the past, just on the composer and the librettist. The composer, Camille Saint-Saëns, was born in Paris in 1835, and he died in Algiers in 1921. So he moves over into the 20th century, and as a French composer, it's not surprising that he'd be born in France, in Paris, but the fact that he died in Algiers, like, keep that in your minds, because we're going to come back to these issues. He was a composer, but he also was a virtuoso pianist and organist and toured a lot. A really important international musical figure. He's best known today for the danse macabre, which if you don't think you know it, you really do, because it's in commercials and movies and background just in our Western culture. The organ symphony, Symphony No. 3, that has an orchestra and an organ. The Carnival of Animals, which interesting wasn't published in his life, but has become since a very well-known piece that is frequently played for children. And then this opera. So he's best known for these works. However, he is somebody who wrote a very wide repertoire. He strongly defended French music, and I put that in quotation marks. He founded the society, the National Society of Music, Société Nationale de Musique, in 1871. So if we think of, and I've sort of brought this up, Samson and Delilah was first performed in 1877. So in that time, he's very concerned about this National Music Society for encouraging and performing works by French composers such as Fauré, César Franck, Chabrier, Debussy, Dukas, Ravel, sort of the leading folks, French composers from the end of the 19th into the early 20th century. So very strongly supporting French music. However, he was also a very big admirer of German music. He was friends with Liszt. He knew the singer Pauline Viardot, who was a big singer. She was an Italian singer, brother or sister of Manuel Garcia, whose father, Manuel Garcia, the father, was Rossini's first barber of Seville. Pauline Viardot, Manuel Garcia Jr., and Maria Malibran. So Viardot comes from a really important singing family who then settled in Paris, or she did. Viardot, I'm going to mention her a little bit later. And he was also friends with Rossini, Bellini, and Gounod. He performed as a pianist Schumann, defended Wagner's works. He went to the first Ring cycle in 1876. He also defended Wagner's works in writing, prose writing, and he was the first one to conduct Liszt's symphonic poems in France. Now, this might sound like, oh, wow, that's like not a big deal. It was a big deal because you've got France is this international artistic center. Opera is a big thing, and German symphony is a huge thing. And he's saying we need to have French music that's not only opera. We need to have symphonies, we need to have chamber music, we need to have instrumental music. Ars Gallica. So that's actually the one thing I knew about Saint-Saëns coming into this, as well as the well-known works. And I want to sort of open that up to you, that defending French music is a thing, even while you can appreciate music from Germany. And we also have in 1871 the Franco-Prussian War, so nationalities in terms of, what's French, what's German. Okay, another thing is he was familiar with and studied what was considered older music. So music of Handel, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, critical editions of music, having music, because usually music would be written and then the idea of a repertory would, oh dear, was that me? No. The idea of a repertory was still sort of new, but having older music, and especially German music, but he also was in critical editions for Gluck and was interested in Rameau. So there's an incredible sense of cosmopolitanism about Saint-Saëns. And in fact, he traveled extensively. In the 1890s, he concertized and went on tour to Russia. He met Tchaikovsky a few times. He went to South America. He went to the Canary Islands, Scandinavia, East Asia, England, and also concertized here in the United States, Philadelphia, Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York, San Francisco. I mean, for somebody in the 19th century where we didn't have planes, you couldn't take a train across, he was traveling a lot. This is an area of Saint-Saëns research that actually isn't known so well. 1894 to 95, he went to the Far East via the Suez Canal, which was new in 1870, 71. So this included Cairo, Alexandria. He saw the pyramids of Giza. In 1895, in March and April, he went to Vietnam. He spent 6 weeks in Saigon. He went to the Théâtre Chinois and listened to the Chinese orchestra there. He also, during this trip, went to Saigon and, Con Son, an island in Vietnam. He wasn't just, once you were traveling back then, you would stay for a while, but the extent of travel. And in 1910 through 11, he again traveled back to Egypt and Algeria. In fact, he returned to Algeria several times, and remember, that's where he died in 1921. And Algeria is an incredibly important and fraught place of colonial expansion for France. Okay, we will come back to that. Let's talk about Samson and Delilah and its compositional history. And this was fascinating for me to learn. He began thinking about this as early as 1859. So he's born in 35. He's in his 20s when he was thinking of this. He began to work on the opera 67 through 68 and then finished it from 73 to 77. So this is a really important work that sort of definitely spans a wide range of his career. Now, he has 13 operas. Very few of them are known, but this Samson and Delilah, none of the others had this hard a time getting going, but it's certainly the one that we remember. The opera started in Saint-Saëns' mind as an idea for an oratorio. And we'll talk about that in a moment, sort of why that's an unusual thing to have a biblical opera. And so it makes sense that he would take a biblical subject and think of it as an oratorio. However, Ferdinand Lemaire, who was actually right around the age of Saint-Saëns, though he died much younger, he was married to his wife's cousin, so they were distantly related, Lemaire and Saint-Saëns. And Lemaire was he was a poet, and he said, Saint-Saëns said, "Would you help me make this story into an oratorio?" And Lemaire said, I think you got an opera here. And so it was his idea to turn it into an opera. Interestingly, not much has been written about Lemaire, but the little bit he's described as a Creole from Martinique. Now, Creole is an interesting term, and it means many things for different regions. From what we know, for the French, it meant particularly people living in the Caribbean who had ties to France. So this involved French people. So in terms of what Lemaire looks like, and I haven't been able to find a picture of him, could be a man who is French, but was born and raised, coming from French parentage, born and raised in Martinique. He could be a child of an interracial French and African or indigenous Martinique person from Martinique. These terms, Creole, are unclear for what they it covers a wide range. If you think of here in the United States, we have Louisiana, New Orleans, in that area, and what Creole can mean there. So he's described as being a Creole from Martinique. The opera, Samson and Delilah, continuing with its compositional history, it premiered in the Ducal Theater in Weimar in German translation, December 2nd, 1877. So this is unusual. What's considered one of the leading 19th century French operas in the repertory still today was performed. It took a long time from 1859 when he was thinking about it. Then he was thinking of making it an oratorio. We'll talk about that. It turned out being an opera. And it was first performed in German. And it was Liszt, his friend Franz Liszt, who said, "Hey, I've got a place where you can perform it." Liszt used to be the conductor and the main director at this theater in Weimar, but he'd stepped down but still had a lot of influence. The opera then went to Hamburg. It went to other theaters in Rouen, in Paris, before it finally got to the Paris Opera in 1892, 25 years after its premiere. Oh, there it is, sorry. All right. We've got 4 questions. We're on question number 3. How does Samson and Delilah, this opera, fit into this French grand opera tradition? And this is the issue of oratorio. And an oratorio is, usually it's a story, but it's a story that can have characters who either have individual names or it can be characters. Most people know around Christmas there's Handel's Messiah. Also that's performed around Easter time too. And that is a wonderful example of an oratorio. You've got the birth of Jesus, you've got the Old Testament leading up to the birth, proclaiming it. You've got the birth. You've got sort of leading into the crucifixion. So you don't have people who have names per se, but you have shepherds. You've got sort of different prophets, John the Baptist, sort of his world. So an oratorio is a story that works like an opera, but has a religious background. There are certain oral elements of oratorio that when an audience of that time period would recognize. So the prominence of the chorus and the use of counterpoint. Most operas have choruses, particularly in the 19th century, big grand choruses. But how they're being written, rather than a main melody supported by, in 4-part harmony, counterpoint means that you have a theme, an idea that's sung in repetition, sort of in imitation. The most strict form of that is called a fugue, and we're actually going to listen to one in a moment from Samson and Delilah. The story was genre of an oratorio. The story is a sacred, religious subject. For Samson and Delilah, it's from the Old Testament. While Samson is discussed in several books, it's the story with Delilah is in Judges 16. And then even when another thing about how oratorio fits into the opera world, because it's similar to opera yet different, but one of the big things in the 19th century is that you do not have the the secular profane genre of opera during Lent, at least not in Italy. So that's when you go to oratorio. Okay, yep, and this is to keep the sacred, secular, spiritual, profane boundaries intact. Now, you can think, but wait a minute, aren't there operas on religious subjects? There aren't that many, and the best known example would be Verdi's Nabucco from 1841, which is Verdi's first breakthrough opera. He has 2 lesser known operas before, but Nabucco was it, and in his biography he talks about, oh yeah, later in my career I would have never set this opera, but I did it early on, and this is the story of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, now we're moving to opera. So Samson and Delilah is in between. It started in Saint-Saëns' mind as an oratorio. It's got the religious subject. It's got some musical elements that we'll listen to soon that sort of state counterpoint with the chorus. But Act 2, we're not talking oratorio. It really heats up. There's a wonderful picture that Alex found for me on Hedy Lamar's Dalila in Cecil B. Milne's Samson and Delilah, the big epic film from 1949. So we have this big seduction number, and if you know the opera, or if you're just learning it, it starts as this beautiful number by Delilah, and then moves into a duet once Samson joins her. I'm gonna play, this is there are a few famous moments in this opera, but this is sort of definitely the most famous vocal part. The Bacchanal comes later, which we'll play. And I'm really pleased to be able to play for you this is Janae Bridges from last night during the dress rehearsal, and with the magic that dramaturg John Dean is able to do to make this happen for us. So you will hear this on Friday and Sunday. It's so hard to stop that. But this incredible long lyrical line that we'll get to a little bit later with a quotation from a singer, Alina Garancha, talking about sort of the milk and honey of sort of singing these incredibly smooth, beautiful long lines. Okay, so an incredible seduction. This is not oratorio writing, this is very much an opera. We've got this idea of opera genre with dance music, and this is where we get a lot of the sort of the otherness of this, and we're going to move into that conversation a bit more. I want to play a couple of examples of music, and we're going to contrast these two. So the first one is in the first act, and it's we've got the Philistines and the Hebrews, and this is a chorus of the Hebrews, and they're singing in an oratorio style. We've got this counterpoint, which means we have one line, and then it's repeated, and it goes through the chorus, building from the bottom, the bass, up to the soprano. So I just wanted to play a little snippet of that. That is very unusual choral writing for an opera. You get it occasionally, but knowing that this was an oratorio and having that imitative counterpoint being sung by the chorus of Hebrews, that really says oratorio. And so it's not, now you're in the know, like, oh yeah, this is sort of, these are part of the styles here. Now let's do from the Bacchanal in the beginning of sort of as we're heading into the finale of the opera in the third act, the second scene. This is where you have, again, it's an interesting case of it's in the temple of Dagon, and you've got Philistine priestesses, and yet, so it's this religious world, and yet it's using this very exoticized, and we'll talk a little bit more about that sort of sound. This is the famous Bacchanal. So while Mancour is sort of the most famous vocal melody in this opera, the Bacchanal in the third act is the most famous sort of non-vocal, other famous melody. On, but that little snippet had so many musical signifiers of doing something that was meant to evoke a non-Western sound. While we have sort of a religious counterpoint for the Hebrews, for the Philistine priestesses, you have the drums doing the, sort of those open fifths, and then you've got this sort of sinuous chromatic line, which almost today, sort of that, it sort of references snake charmer music in some ways. It's sort of what we have in the 20th century thought of as, oh, this is exotic. Then you've got the sparkly instruments of the triangles, the cymbals, like it's bringing out all these effects. Great example of Saint-Saëns using some of this cosmopolitan travel to other places, bringing in his version of what he thinks it sounds like. All right, and then another big element with the genre and what makes this operatic is we've got the spectacle and the stage effects. You can only imagine how hard this is to stage, where you bring a whole temple down. This is very classic for French grand opera. Okay. Another element in here, and I just want to spend a moment with Delilah because she's such an interesting character, how she's configured in the plot. Most operas, if you think about it, have leading roles or almost leading roles for two women. A great example, all of Meyerbeer's French grand operas, Aida, perhaps a better known opera, you've got Aida and Amneris, Verdi's opera for Paris in 1867, Don Carlo, you've got Elisabetta and Eboli. Even an opera where you have a mezzo lead, such as Carmen from 1875, just 2 years before this, in 1877. You've got Carmen, our lead, who's a mezzo, but also Micaela. So it's very rare to have an opera where Delilah is the main character. There's no other solo woman's voice that you hear. And the fact that she's a mezzo who really has a lot of low singing, sort of very earthy, very sensual. She's such an unusual role. It's a really interesting portrayal of women. And this is something we can certainly talk about more in the Q&A. But I think that Delilah gives us an interesting portrayal of gender. It's easy to look at her as a villain. She seduces him and, finds out the secret of his strength and is part of his downfall. And she talks about wanting revenge. But also in the opera, we learn in the second act, right before Samson comes, she's waiting for him. She's tried 3 times to get his secret. And you begin to see her, sometimes when you have to coax something out of someone, you actually begin to believe it. And this is a wonderful area for where the singer who sings Delilah gets to decide, am I going to make her this evil temptress? Or am I going to put this open that maybe she actually has fallen in love with Samson? Maybe that seduction, that incredible number that starts with as her solo and then develops into their duet, maybe there's something genuine and real about it. There's complexity to her role. She's not just a bad, negative character, unless you want to play her that way, but there's sort of an opening there, which I think is something that makes thinking about these operas so interesting, how there's not just one interpretation. Of all the characters, to me, in this opera, she seems like the most complex. And to just look at her as being a negative character is really to make her much more two-dimensional than she is. So, operas with 2 leading women. This is not Delilah, but actually from a couple of years ago here in Seattle of Carmen. And Carmen is a nice example of somebody similar to Delilah. They're both French operas. They're both from the 70s. Carmen from 75, Samson and Delilah from 77. And yet, Carmen has to deal with Micaela. And Micaela was added mainly because, remember, this opera was performed at the Opera Comique. And it was a concession from Mérimée novella that the librettist said, okay, we will make this more family theater-like. We'll give you the good girl Micaela. Okay, let's, French Grand Opera. So here we go. I'm repeating it yet again. What makes Samson and Delilah very related. It's not an oratorio, though it has oratorio elements. But with French Grand Opera, they're the divertissement, the ballet, and we have 2 ballets in this opera. One near the end of Act 1 with it's the Pharisee high priestesses, and the Bacchanal, where those priestesses dance again near the end of the opera. We have grand spectacle and pageantry with the destruction of the Temple of Dagon. And you can just think about this in your mind rather than trying to see some opera company destroy its set and keep everybody alive on stage. And we've got the plots with the larger political situation with the personal drama. The church-state conflict, the Philistines are defeating the Hebrews versus the personal story of this love story and how it's configured. Whether Delilah is really falling in love, where she starts as vengeful, but then is there a moment where it becomes real? For me, listening to the Mancoeur and in the second act, it always convinces me. I think, oh, maybe it's going to work this time. Yeah, sadly, it doesn't. Okay, let's move on to perhaps one of the more interpretive around cultural studies and thinking about how do we think of empire? What is Orientalism? How does it relate to colonialism? So key concepts, I've got 4, and on this slide I'm going to present the first 2. And these are big, messy topics. I'm giving you definitions that I've got, from different places, but at least they can sort of spell things out. I'll read them because I know sitting in the back of my eyes, I can barely do it here. Colonialism, the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. So this whole idea of Creoles having French people go to Martinique or go to the Caribbean, that's what colonialism is. Imperialism is very closely connected. It's when a country extends its power into other territories for economic or political gain. There's a goal of imperialism, and that's to acquire the resources, often through exploitation and force. Motives for imperialism include economic, cultural, political, moral, and exploratory, sort of taking and looking at things, taking control. Let's focus now on Orientalism and exoticism. These are just working definitions. Orientalism is studying the representations of what is considered the East, and I'm using these scare quotes intentionally, and the global South in terms that reinforce negative stereotypes. Orientalism is actually a term that is the title of a book by Edward Said in 1978 that is still taught and still really relevant for how Orientalism is how one area sees another. And we used to have these divisions of East and West. We've also seen first world, third world, second world, third world, developing world, and more commonly, or in the discourse around this, people refer to the global South and the global North. Exoticism, styles or traits considered characteristic of a distant foreign country. Now, Orientalism and exoticism are terms that you see a lot in reference to music. And all of these terms, whether it's colonialism, imperialism, Orientalism, and exoticism, the way we're talking about it for sort of analyzing a work of art, they refer to power, control, and hierarchy. So we're not talking about two places on equal footing coming together. Instead, we're talking about one place dictating the terms and taking something from another. And this hooks into sort of how these terms, imperialism, colonialism, Orientalism, exoticism, they're about power and control and hierarchy, and they interact with, meaning they are in this world of markers of identity. So it's not just taking land, but it's how women are seen, or how race is constructed, or how ethnicity is articulated. What are economic circumstances for who has money and who doesn't? How is, in Said's Orientalism, he frequently talks about the West has feminized and exoticized the East, so with sexual expression. And any other terms of identity can be worked into this framework for how we talk about unequal distributions of power. I know, a lot to think about. Another way for thinking and bringing in these interpretive frames onto Samson and Delilah is if we rethink French history. For those of you who know all of the different empires and the Restoration, the Bourbons, the Napoleon III, basically French history is all about these different tussles of power. If we go back to the French Revolution, think about it not just as the French Revolution, but involve its colonial history with the Haitian Revolution that was happening pretty much concurrently. With French history in the long 19th century, whether we've got the Napoleon III, the Restoration, the Second Empire, we've got these series of conflicts, and it's between the ideals of a republic and a despotic rule. how we talk about this with cultural studies is that we talk about at home, so in this case France is called the métropole, and then abroad, the colonies. So when you're doing reading or see this term, the métropole, in this discourse, that's what's referring to the colonizing country. Oh, okay. Another way for rethinking French history is, and how it is affecting our possible ideas of Samson and Delilah, is think of Napoleon's rise with early on his 1798 Egyptian campaign. And this actually brought back, you can see in the picture on the left, sort of the pyramids in the background. These are of Napoleon, bringing back artifacts which lead to this genre of French Egyptology. Auguste Mariette was a very famous French Egyptologist, and he was the one who wrote, sort of helped Verdi with the background for Aida and that story. So, the French colonial empire, that time period is generally divided into two different eras. First, we have leading up from the 16th century through around 1814 when Napoleon is defeated, and as he's moving towards into Russia, and so much of that empire sort of is lost by 1814, and that's the time of the first French colonial empire. Here's a picture of France in 1712, so before the French Revolution. And then we've got the French colonies. These are in the Caribbean. I know it's really hard to see, and I'm told that these, this talk and all will be up online, so you can look at the map more closely. But here you can see, oh, there. We've got Algeria, which is this important part of French history, as we will see in just a moment. We have other areas below with Tahiti and Indochine. Okay, oh, here we go. The second French colonial empire with the conquest of Algeria in 1830. So we have the first period that goes up through Napoleon, and then the second period that goes up through World War II. And chief areas are North and Western Africa, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Central and East Africa, and the South Pacific. And these maps outline some of those areas. Okay, there are goals of French colonialism. One is this moral issue. So it's not just about conquest of now we're adding to our empire, but there's an element of helping other parts benefit from Christianity and French culture. And during this time in the 1880s, which is right around sort of in this era right after Samson and Delilah, but definitely in the time that Saint-Saëns is making all his far trips. Jules Ferry, who is the French prime minister, and he's a very big supporter of the colonial mission. And this is a quotation I found that gets repeated over and over that he made when he was prime minister. The higher races have a right over the lower races. They have a duty to civilize the inferior races. And you think of what's happening in not just in France, but in Europe, as we're moving also things into the United States with Darwinism, the eugenics movement. So this is all a part of this expansion. This leads to an idea of assimilation, which was a particular way that France had with dealing with its colonies. Rather than having the colonies far away and not come to the metropole, this idea to extend full citizen rights to the colonies, which involves setting white permanent settlers to the colonies and part of the empire, who are the Creoles, and also having them come back to Paris to be full French citizens, which means not to wear headscarves or not to speak their languages, but to be sort of brought into what it means in their minds to be French. Okay, So that's a lot to think about, and I want to move on to leave a lot of time for questions and comments. For some of you, you're very familiar with those ideas and terms. Some of you might still be newer with them. I'm not trying to tell you what to think, but to let you know of the different discourses out there for how people have talked about what's happening in opera. Samson and Delilah is just one, and it's a big example of these larger themes happening. But before we move to that, I want to move to a couple of quotations from the interpreters of these works. And the first one will be with Alina Garancha as she's singing Delilah. This is from the Metropolitan Opera production from 2018. It's Roberto Alagna as Samson, Garancha as Delilah, and this is for those of you who can access the Met high definition on demand, you can watch this there. And she talks about, Susan Graham is interviewing her, and Garancha says, I think first of all for the aria, and this is the Mon Coeur, Savoir Toi, it's just melody, that never-ending, flowing river of honey, you know, or oil or something, which just caresses you, your soul, your being, your everything. And then at the second part, when the tenor comes in, it just becomes magic. And it's so wonderful to hear her say this, because she's like, really? I have a feeling that singing this and experiencing the atmosphere, it's like the time stops. And it is just, I mean, wow, it's exciting to be a part of it. So in terms of how do we perform these things, you know, and her Delilah is incredible. And it's wonderful to hear her talk about sort of that image has just stayed with me, this never-ending flowing river of melody. Moving on, she says, I think that it's really the relationship that is not meant to be, that there could be something, but because of God, religion, because of society, because I don't know what in life, it just cannot happen. But if these two souls would be in a glass bubble, they probably would live happily ever after. I want to believe it. I mean, we don't know so much about Delilah herself. I like to make my characters human. And I want to give them a certain sensibility and sensitivity. And why not? I mean, we've seen enough bitches. It's so sweet the way she says this. Because she's Latvian and her English is perfect, or very close to perfect, and yet she's so serious and intense, and then it's almost like she realizes, oh, well, you know, we've seen enough of the other. I want to, so her interaction seems to be, I want to, you know, singing it, it's a musical thing where you just sort of make that melody go. Time stops, it's magical, wow, it's incredible. And then she says, you know, I really try to see the humanity in this character. Just last month, the Detroit Opera, and I was in Michigan for 27 years before I just moved to North Carolina, but my family is still in Michigan. And the Detroit Opera did a concert performance of Aida. And it was a one-time performance, December 30th, so it was kind of like a pre-New Year's Eve. And Yuval Sharon, who is the artistic director, he said that, and I think this really resonates for a concert production that we're going to be seeing on Friday and Sunday of an opera written in this time about spectacle. Aida, though it was written for Cairo, it's so much in the French Grand Opera style. Sharon says, presenting Aida solely in concert, then, doesn't just let us sidestep the uncomfortable imagery that so often accompanies this popular opera, nor is it solely an economic consideration. And he was talking about, you know, having elephants and animals there for the triumphal scene. Instead, hearing the music in non-representational form as pure music brings us closer to the complexity and humanity of the work that is rarely seen as either complex or humane. A concert decenters triumphant maximalism and brings us closer to the intimacy and intricacy of the opera's unmonumental core. So he's actually making an argument that it's better to see, and I like this standpoint, that taking away the spectacle, the pageantry, the exoticism, the orientalism, that just listening to the music lets us focus on that and lets us hear, yes, she's falling in love with him, or yes, these are true emotions. This, the universalism of, or the story hooks into a universal feeling through the specificity of this story. So even though Samson and Delilah is biblical times and it's about a man whose strength comes from his hair, you know, this is not what we deal with in 2023, I don't think. But we do feel this idea of falling in love with someone, and falling in love with someone who comes from perhaps another different rival, other to us, who's unfamiliar to us, and who might seem to be an enemy of something we're belonging to, whether it's religion, whether it's nationality, nation, whether it's political belief system, and that there can be something that brings two people together that is so powerful. There's something about that where seeing it not particularly staged, but just letting us get that essence, there's a real power in it. I'm interested in what you think about these things, and I want to thank you so much for giving me so much time. We have time for questions and discussion.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. I understood the negativity that goes along with colonialism.
Yeah.
That was easy. I didn't quite understand the negativity that goes, though, with exoticism, if I could even say that word.
It's a good question. What is wrong with exoticism? Because on one hand, it's like, think of yourself as Saint-Saëns. I'm going to all these different countries. The music is different. We don't have the radio. We don't have records. You know, I'm learning this, and I'm doing my best to absorb some of this information and this sound. I want to share it. There is nothing wrong with that. The difficulty becomes when that is seen as being the true representation, when you have other representations from the signifying place themselves. So when you've got, but we're dealing with the 19th century in this case, just for argument's sake, and it's not like we've got people from Japan or the Far East saying, no, that music, the Bacchanal, isn't my music. One of the tough things, though, is when you've got Saint-Saëns and a whole world of representation of the other only by people who have the power on the side of, you know, the colonial power. We're in a position now where we don't have to do that. We can travel, we have books, we have the internet, we can go, if you've got the economic means, you can go there yourself and see it. So some of these arguments are tough because you're like, but isn't it nice and good and important to learn other cultures? The tough thing with exoticism is when you're only getting it filtered through somebody who's not the true representation.
Okay, thank you.
Does that help? Or, I mean, these are great questions. And we're talking at a time now where we do get to travel and do things, so it almost feels as it arcane. Do these things not work anymore? Other questions? So who's representing whom becomes a tough issue. How do we look at the power? How do we look at what's going on? What do we think about Saint-Saëns? I want to open up, and please go study this. A lot needs to be, how much, was that a real tune in the Bacchanal that he found, or was it one he made up? Was he approximating other tonal systems that he only could do in a Western diatonic? Like, were there microtones from other instruments and tuning systems that, and is that a bad thing? Is that a mocking thing? Is that, these questions, if they were super easy, well then our world would be much less interesting.
So I love the last two quotes you showed because those were both examples of like, okay, we're going to take what's hard about this and put it aside and think about the beautiful music, or take away the pomp and just do it as a concert.
Yeah.
But do you personally think with some of the difficulty of some of these topics of exoticism, butterfly is a great example, where they shouldn't be done anymore.
Oh, wow.
What do you do with that?
Well, I definitely think they shouldn't be done as they had been done in the past with no commentary. I think, I love the music so much, I grew up with it. At the end of Act 1 of Butterfly, I think maybe they really have fallen in love. You know, like maybe he's not going to be a jerk. Maybe, because it just feels, the music is telling me there's something so real and wonderful. And yet Butterfly, Mikado is another one where it's so hard to think about how do we do them. I don't know, but I think an organization needs to talk about that and needs to discuss, and I think the way we've seen it so frequently in the past, where you just sort of put it and say art is apolitical, and you're, like I remember one of the things that got me into writing about the Black Opera book was I was like, you know, people are still blacking up or wearing yellow face, and that doesn't happen on TV or on Broadway or in film. Even most high schools don't do this, and yet nobody talks about it. And I'm feeling a little uncomfortable. And people said to me, oh, Naomi, you are so sensitive. You are blowing this out of proportion. You know, you just take a chill pill. And I'm like, and I'm wondering why it's hard to bring new people into the opera. We're doing these things and not talking about it. Now, do I ever want Aida to go away? Absolutely not. So I'm invested in the tradition. I'm not going to apologize for that, but I will admit to, we got to see where we are in our culture for talking about these things. Yeah, thanks, great. You guys asking good questions. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. It was really nice. I was just going to ask, with how, when talking about power over time, with Saint-Saëns going to these places and then creating this piece that maybe he didn't know that it would, or he probably definitely didn't know, it would become such a huge representation of what Eastern music sounded like to so many people for centuries, you know? And so the power, how do you define power as it travels across time? Because now, well, okay, let me start over. Now as I'm thinking about how we present these pieces,
Yeah.
now the power is not so much, or the onus of this piece, not so much on Saint-Saëns, but on the proliferators of the piece and the presenters of the piece. How do
Seattle Opera.
Exactly. So how do you then sort of define how power might work in a system like that over time?
That's a really nice factor to throw into it, that things aren't static. And what it meant for Saint-Saëns was something different than what it means for us today. I think one reason why I feel so good about talking about this here is to bring these questions up. And perhaps it's a cop-out, but as a professor, I feel like, well, I don't really have to solve the answer. You know, can I just bring the questions up and give us more knowledge? And more knowledge is more complicated, and more, you know, which is good. But what does Seattle Opera do when they produce this? Is it as Yuval Sharon and as Seattle Opera are doing now, or is the concert performance the way to go? And let me tell you, this concert performance, I don't want to do too many spoilers for those of you who might not have caught it yesterday for the dress rehearsal. It is not boring. It is, I mean, visually it is not boring. Musically it's so credible, rich, but it's not just them standing there singing. There's, Janae Bridges has the most wonderful wardrobe. The guys look fine too, but, you know, come on, gowns, and she's amazing. There's lighting that's really effective. And you do get to just luxuriate in the sound. And you know the story, and there's super titles that tell you, and it's a biblical story, which a lot of, you know, people are familiar with. What do we do now? I teach this, you know, as a professor, and I teach this, I want people to know about it. I want them to decide what to do. I want them to join boards of opera companies, and I want them to say, we can't just do this without talking about it. Is it enough to just talk about it? Should we make a stand? We need to do this work. We don't need to do this. How do you do Madama Butterfly today? That's a hard one, because to me it feels the stereotyping is really strong? I don't know, but thank you for asking. What do you guys think? Should it matter? I think no information is annoying and irresponsible. Oh, we got a brave soul. Thanks, John.
I really appreciate your talk.
Thank you.
I think it's really important that we do this. I'm the father of 2 beautiful mixed-race daughters, and the exoticism lays a minefield that they still navigate today. And so I think if we don't talk about it,
Right.
we don't defuse the minefield.
Yeah, maybe talking about it. I think one of the big issues, I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm spending this year, and I'm trying to stay away, the 6 feet, sorry, I'm not doing that. This model of there's harm from these negative stereotypes, and people want us to get to repair, to get over it. This is in the past. It's not like with slavery or colonialism. I mean, you can make arguments about that, but after World War II, there's been a big decolonial, post-colonial movement, at least with European countries. So get over it, we're done. And yet I find that the harm needs to go through with sensitivity, some sort of care, so that we can get to the repair. You can't just say, get over it and be done, because some of those legacies are still continuing. Economic disparities, health disparities, things that, yes, it happened a long time ago, but it wasn't fully fixed. We don't know that history, so it's important to uncover it. In terms of big examples with healthcare and the Tuskegee medical syphilis experiments, or Henrietta Lacks and sort of using her cancer cells and not being so open with the family, or with making infertility treatments for giving hysterectomies to certain women of color or to people who are considered not appropriate for breeding. Like these examples still have elements today. Native American boarding schools and sort of what that's done to communities. These are things that we, even if we don't do them all now, we still feel them, and we can't just get to repair. We need to move through to the healing. And eventually we do need to say it's time to move forward. I don't think in the United States with a lot of these issues we've gotten there. And I think representation around race and ethnicity, around sexual expression, around so many other things, we need to do that, we need to get to the repair and get there. Maybe we will get there at some point and it'll be great, but I don't think we're there yet. There's too much harm.
Rhiannon Giddens has a wonderful podcast, and
Aria Code.
Aria Code, yes. And in the first season, she talked about Othello, and she talked about the blackface, or darkening of the face. Now, she acknowledged that it's within the text where Othello talks about whether Desdemona doesn't love him because he is black. And she eventually said, no, I cannot see it as a costume. As some people have argued, it's like putting on a costume.
Yeah.
She said, no, it is too hurtful as representation of the minstrel shows.
Yes.
And so while Rhiannon Giddens could acknowledge conflict, there was no question for her that it's not appropriate.
I'm a big fan of Aria Code, and full disclosure, I've been on 2 episodes, but I wasn't on the Othello one, and I should listen to that. You bring up a tough one with Othello, because I have heard, and I won't name them, but some senior black singers who defend the use of the blackface, whereas I think Rhiannon Giddens, somebody who I admire a lot, but I even admire some of these other folks too. But I like her response, because for us today, minstrelsy is this awful specter, and I find it distracting, and I think the music is just as gorgeous no matter what you look like. And the issue, too, of who gets to sing what role. Othello is such a monster role. I want anyone on the planet who can do it. And yeah. Oh, has he? He is an incredible, our Samson is just amazing. Young-hoon Lee is, I don't want to mispronounce his name. Oh my gosh, you are in for a treat. That is a voice. I mean, I was anticipating that Janae Bridges was going to be pretty amazing. And indeed she is. But he was a voice I didn't know. Oh my goodness. Just incredible. I've become a fan. I want to know what he's up to and what he's doing. And thankfully we have the internet and I can follow him. But who's singing what? Okay, oh, we have a hard stop.
We have a mere 30 seconds left. If anyone has a super quick question. Otherwise, I suppose we could
I want to
leave it
thank
there.
you all for such a good discussion. Thank you.